Okay, so let's begin with I'm not racist. And that's a phrase we hear whenever someone's defending their questionable actions. There's been a misunderstanding, or someone simply reassuring themselves of their stance on racial equality. And although all of us, I'm hoping, aren't externally racist, we're probably pretty internally racist. And by internal racism, I'm talking about the racial bias you hold within yourself, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. So, to put internal racism on a spectrum, one side of the spectrum would be conscious internal racism, while the other would be unconscious internal racism. So, conscious bias would refer to a thought you have about someone based on their skin color. But you're not going to voice this thought because part of your mind knows that if you do, people are going to tell you, that's pretty racist, bro. So, you keep it within yourself to avoid being attacked. And unconscious bias is exactly what it sounds like, bias in your mind that exists on an unconscious and unnoticed level. So, with my experience with internal racism, it actually happened quite recently, and it went unnoticed and at first, but later, upon reflecting on what I had felt and thought in the moment, I realized what a weirdly prejudiced thought I had had. And I was with my dad in Target's parking lot, and we were the only ones in the parking lot at the time, except for another person wandering on the curb. And an important detail to note is that this person was black. I didn't think anything of it until they yelled at us, "Hey guys," and then they started to approach us. Although this person had a masculine voice and a masculine form, I will be referring to them with gender neutral pronouns to maintain respect. And they didn't have a mask on, but thank God they were a safe distance away from us. So nothing had even happened yet, but I was already pretty anxious and I'm kind of unsure of my safety. And they didn't seem completely sober, and their speech was kind of incoherent, so I couldn't hear or understand it very well. But what I did understand included a lot of profanity, and that kind of threw me off. So I remember feeling very nervous and kind of scared, like I was in danger or I was going to get hurt in some way. But they talked about being robbed while living in San Francisco, which I think is kind of a random topic to approach strangers about in a Target parking lot. And my dad looked pretty confused and didn't want to be rude, so he also engaged in the conversation and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry about that." And he sounded really unsure and confused and definitely looked like he wanted to leave the situation. And so then the person on the street said, "And I know y'all are Asian. I can tell." And at that point, I was thinking, oh my God, am I about to get COVID discrimination for the first time? That's a milestone. And thankfully, they didn't project any racism towards us, but they did instead say something pretty unexpected, and they shouted, "You know, y'all Asians inspire me so much. I love the Asians up in San Francisco. Y'all are the reason for my honor." That was what they said, except with a lot more swearing, and then they made a jabbing motion with their finger towards us. I could tell my dad was expecting something much worse as well, and we were both pleasantly surprised at the outcome. And we said thank you pretty awkwardly and continued walking into Target. And I thought that was the last time I'd ever see of them, but it did not end there. When my dad and I were at the self checkout paying for our items, we saw the same person dancing by the automatic doors, and eventually they poked their head in and started talking to some people who were walking in and out, and they were just kind of minding their own business at first. And then the person decided to start shouting at everybody in earshot and said, "Hey guys, I think I left my shoes in here. Can someone go get them for me?" And I was kicked out of the store, so I can't go in. So I need someone else to get my shoes for me. And nobody answered, and an employee instead just urged the person to stay away from the store. So when we exited the store, my dad purposely took a route back to the car where the person from before couldn't see us anymore. And admittedly, I was intimidated and pretty scared. And when I got home later that night, I reflected on the incident, specifically on how I reacted to that black person's presence. And I don't exactly know what led me to this conclusion, but I came to the realization I wasn't scared because of COVID discrimination or because this person wasn't sober, but rather because this person was black. Okay, so I replayed the scenario in my head and filled in the person who had approached us with people of different races and genders. And overall, I noticed from my own personal study that I felt the most endangered around males and black people, and the least endangered around women and Asian people. So now when I realized this, I was obviously pretty disappointed in myself. Like, wow, Sophie, that is pretty prejudiced and racist of you, especially for someone who enjoys spamming her Instagram story with the importance of equality. Very nice. And I believe what led me to feeling this way was most likely stereotypes that had been inflicted on me by society. And although I was never directly taught by my traditionally Vietnamese parents that Black people, specifically Black males, were dangerous, the way they are represented by the media it definitely affected my opinion on them. And so growing up, I noticed many criminals were Black. And of course, now I know there is racial bias in the police forces. But please keep in mind, this is something I noticed while I was in a more ignorant and impressionable stage of my life. And so, meanwhile, entertainment usually painted the Black male as dominant and intimidating, and the Black woman as strong and sassy, and either one ready to cuss you out in an instant. Same with the way I imagined I would react to an Asian person approaching. Seeing that I, myself, am Asian, I wouldn't feel as intimidated for pretty obvious reasons. And to be more specific, I would not be as wary with an Asian woman, most likely also because of stereotypical and historical reasons. So, stereotypically, Asian women are presented as docile or submissive, and historically, Asian women were pressured to be quiet and gentle, to be a doll like display, standing behind their much stronger husband. And honestly, this is pretty ridiculous. Like, I mean, have you seen Vietnamese mothers chase around their daughters with a broomstick? I was pretty shocked that I actually thought this way at all. So I realized that this is a very ignorant way to view people of the same race, which is why I was so surprised that I, an avid hater of stereotypes, let myself succumb to this unnoticed way of thinking. So now let's move on to something a little bit different, the Wolfers and Price 12-year study on NBA referees. So Justin Wolfers, an assistant professor of business and public policy, along with Joseph Price, a Cornell grad student in economics, created a study on the relationship between the race of the referee and player compared to the amount of fouls that player was flagged for. And they studied over 600,000 foul calls between 1991 and 2003, and that's a 12-year period. So Wolfers and Price observed white referees flagged Black players at a greater rate than white players. And this observation also correlated with the other, which was Black referees flagging white players at a greater rate than Black players. So according to the researchers on the study's team, there were, quote, different rates at which fouls are called, close quote, which were large enough that the chances of a team succeeding were actually partially reliant on the racial composition of the refereeing team. So the researchers also disclosed a remarkable connection between performance relative to points, rebounds, and turnovers when players were performing in games in which the game moderating officials were primarily composed of the opposite race. So Wolfers and Price had noted, quote, player performance appears to deteriorate at every margin when games are officiated by a larger fraction of opposite race referees, close quote. So while the relationship between white and Black folks have been pretty shaky in the past, and let's be honest, sometimes it still is, one cannot simply assume that the referee flagging players of the opposite race at a greater rate is racist. As we have come to realize, racism is actually sometimes internal and unconscious, affecting our actions, perceptions, and thoughts. And whether we realize it or not, bias, to put it simply, is in our everyday lives. So let's move on to something else. This is the Adrian C. North, David J. Hargreaves, and Jennifer McKendrick's In-Store Music Affects Product Choice Study. Members of the music research group in the psychology department at the University of Leicester in the UK, North, Hargreaves, and McKendrick performed a study to see if music could have an impact on the customer's shopping choices. So here's how the experiment was performed. The shelves of a normal supermarket were filled with varied wine bottles. 50% were French, and the other 50% were German. And all bottles were displayed in different places upon the shelf as well to make sure shelf position wouldn't be an interference. Because, maybe sometimes I, a minor, I don't know why I'd be buying wine, but maybe I want to buy wine that's in the top right corner of the shelf. And on different days, music with a French accordion or German beer color music was played in the background. So as you may have guessed, the music did indeed have an effect on people's decision of what wine to buy. And when there was French music in the background, 76.9% of the French wine was purchased. Meanwhile, when the German music was playing, 73.3% of the German wine was purchased. And after the experiment, when the shoppers, there were 44 in total, were asked if they had noticed the music, only 14%, so about 6 people, said they had acknowledged the music, and only 1 person said it had actively affected their purchasing decision. So from the study, we can see how small changes in the surrounding environment, even something as small as background music, can actually really affect people's actions, whether they notice it or not. And this can be applied to internal racism as well, and how it goes unnoticed a lot of the time. So from here, one can conclude there is a shocking amount of bias in everyday life, which we do not notice at all or have any control over. However, bias is not just a teacher favoring students or kids voting for their friends in the student council election. Those are actually conscious decisions that we make that are actually in our control. And that is the difference between the bias we recognize easily and unconscious bias. One is in our control, while the other is completely random and completely out of our control. Although bias is viewed as negative, we should embrace our natural bias. And what I mean by that is we should accept and become aware of the unseen factors that affect our everyday decisions. And as Benjamin Hayden once proclaimed, fortunately for serious minds, a bias recognized is a bias sterilized. Thank you. Also, now I realize I was frozen the entire time, and I don't know if you guys are speaking to me now, and I don't know if you guys can hear me, but I can't hear or see any of you, so I'm going to leave the meeting and try rejoin.
Oh, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, because it's completely frozen on my end, and I can only see like.
Yeah, that's okay. I can see your face frozen on the screen.
I know, it was looking pretty ridiculous the whole time. So, okay, my computer.
But it's okay, we could hear you, and that's kind of all that matters.
That's great. Okay, this is interesting because I cannot see the Zoom call anymore. Amazing.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly fine.
Yeah, same here.
The Zoom meeting on my computer just disappeared, and the only thing I can see is like the email that you sent me with the link. I think my computer is frozen, but I can still hear you guys. So, I don't know how I'm going to leave the meeting. You guys are probably going to have to end it for me in order to leave. But if you guys have any questions, I would be happy to answer them if I can answer them.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for all our attendees, feel free to put any questions in the chat or the Q&A section.
Yep. It was an amazing speech. Thank you so much, Sophie.
Thank you. I was like kind of worried when I found out that I was frozen the whole time. I was like, wow, that's amazing.
Don't worry, it's fine.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, no problem.
And if there are any questions, I can't see them, so if there are, just like read them to me. And
yeah. They're clapping for you.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no questions, then we can probably move on. But thank you so much, Sophie. I think everyone really enjoyed your speech, and it was really
yeah. And now we will have Gia speaking about the girl in the mirror.
All right.
Awesome. And
okay, this is amazing. My computer is frozen. Sorry about that, guys.
No problem. It's fine. I'll just move Gia to this panelist. All right.